Okay, so it's official. The Australian government has just told every single one of us and the rest of the world that they don't want us to leave. And I don't know if you've seen the news, it's now $412 to get a passport renewed or a new passport in Australia. Firstly, incredibly ridiculous amount. And secondly, let's talk a little bit about that because I think it just shows a bigger systemic issue that no one is talking about, which I don't understand. Firstly, there is a lot of people, when I read comments about this in Reddit and places like that, a lot of people going, oh, it's very expensive to make a passport. While that is true, they make $1 billion a year in revenue from passports. Now you think about that. Does it cost $1 billion to make 25 million people's passports? No. Where do you think the rest of the money goes? The rest of the money goes to nepotism. And the Australian government is shocking for this. I don't care whether you're talking about renewing your passport, and I don't care if you're talking about renewing your driver's license. There is a huge amount of patting on the back in the Australian public service sector. And people talk about how countries in Southeast Asia are corrupt. Australia is just as corrupt. There was an investigation into the passport office, and they found a lot of this money just gets lost through inefficiency. It gets lost through contractors that are mates with someone that makes decisions in the passport office. And that is like every single public service sector. And the price of these passports is just a reflection of that. I think it's absolutely bonkers that the Australian government has the audacity to charge $412 for a passport. You know, it basically just makes it out of reach for everyday Australians. Most Australians don't have $1,000 saved up, let alone $412 for a passport. I don't know what you're going to say. Oh, well, if you can't afford it, you shouldn't have a passport anyway. And yes, you can make the argument that if you don't have the money to buy a passport, you shouldn't travel. But really, it just goes to show that the government doesn't want any of us to leave. If you combine that with the fact that they're trying to introduce a law that taxes Australians regardless of where they are, like the US does, it just reinforces the fact that it's all part of the grand scheme. It's all part of the grand plan. Ultimately, Australia cannot afford for people to leave. We have no manufacturing base in Australia. And because of that, the government relies on every single person that can pay tax, paying exorbitant amounts of tax. Because without the manufacturing base, who foots the bill for the public services? Who foots the bill for the hospitals? Who foots the bills for this? It's the taxpayers. And that's fine. I don't think anyone has an issue paying tax if it's going to stuff. But the passport office is a good example of this. You would be naive to think that that $1 billion in revenue it generates is like a self-funding thing that supports the passport office. You would be incorrect in saying that. Your taxpayers' dollars also go to supporting the passport office, and then they slog us $412 for a passport. And anecdotally, the passports have gotten worse in quality. People get their passports and they're already bent. They have their signatures leak into other pages and things like that. So like, where does this money go? Unfortunately, Australia is just one massive Ponzi scheme at this point. They are robbing the everyday taxpayer to keep the can going down the road. Our government is massive and grossly inefficient. And unfortunately, it's a limbering behemoth and it needs that taxpayers' dollars to keep moving because there's nothing else that can support it. It's not like countries like Southeast Asia where there's a massive manufacturing base supporting the government, or somewhere that has like a massive financial hub. Australia does three things really well: pulling iron ore out of the ground, exporting education, and taking coal and sending it somewhere else. It doesn't process any of it. It doesn't do anything else except that, and taxing people. Now, whether that's a direct tax of anywhere between 36 to 50%, or whether that's an indirect tax like this passport, that's the way you need to look at your license, your passport, and the exorbitant amounts they charge for that stuff. It's just an indirect tax on Australians. GST, it was supposed to be the tax that was supposed to simplify the tax system. If anything, it made the tax system more complex and it didn't remove any taxes. So we now get charged 10% GST on every bit of good and service in the country, yet it didn't remove any taxes. It didn't do anything except increase the tax base of the Australian government. And like I said before, I wouldn't be on here making this video if I thought that that money was being used well. And there's still kids dying of asthma in front of hospitals if they can even get an ambulance at all, because that tax money is not making it to the place it needs to go. It's getting absorbed all the way through the system, through mates knowing mates, giving contracts out, politicians getting paid $400,000 a year, some local councillor embellishing money. It gets absorbed. It just gets taken out piece by piece in the system. Yes, Southeast Asia has a huge amount of corruption, and it's really bad here. But at least people know it exists. In Australia, there's a huge amount of corruption. It's just the Australians think it doesn't exist. It exists at all levels of government, federal, state, and local. That's the reason the hospitals suck. That's the reason why the school system is bursting at the seams. Because not only would they prefer to build houses over schools, the amount of red tape and bureaucracy and cost to build a school in Australia just makes it almost impossible to do. And that's the case in point. It's not the $412. Yes, we have the most expensive passport in the world. I don't know if that's a badge of honor we should be wearing as Australians, but we have the most expensive passport in the world. But it's not that. I understand that if you can't afford a passport, you shouldn't be flying anywhere. You shouldn't be traveling. It's the fact that they have the audacity to charge $412 for that passport, given how much else they tax and they charge people for all the different government services that exist. I just think that this is just another indication that the government doesn't give a shit about any of us. The government is out there to use us as an energy source, as a fuel source to fuel the country, when instead it should be relying on a manufacturing base or a financial base that it decided to get rid of in the 70s and it never looked back. So yeah, I think it's just disappointing, and I think it's just an indictment, and I'd expect it to get more and more expensive, and I expect them to make excuses that the cost is going up. The thing is, I wouldn't say those people at the passport office are getting paid more. It's not like that $412 is because they're getting paid an extra 10% to keep up with inflation. They're probably getting paid the exact same amount or slightly more than they were, and the rest is just going into the government coffers and all their little pats on the shoulders and pats on the backs and the little bits of nepotism that happen in the government. So it's a shame, but it is what it is. It's part of the reason we decided to make the move and sort of check out of that system a little bit. But yeah, I just wanted to get on here and talk about that because there's a lot of people talking about this at the moment and no one's talking about this specifically.